Greetings, everyone. This is Professor Theo Williams. I hope you're doing well and I hope you're trying to stay warm. It's pretty hot outside today. This is a video over form number 2. The question we had this week is why is it important to have a knowledge of history, economics, social science, anthropology, politics, and communication in understanding the layers of intercultural communication? And we talked about those four layers of intercultural, well, not just the four layers of intercultural communication. We talked about the individual layer, then going to the interpersonal layer, then the organizational layer, and then finally concluding with the cultural layer, and how all those layers build upon each other. So who you are as an individual is going to impact how you interact with others. That's your intercultural relationships. And then those relationships, in turn, when you work with a particular organization, oftentimes the culture of those organizations will trickle down to you. There's a certain ethos, there's a certain rules and regulations and policies they try to have their workers adhere to, and it shapes who we are. And finally, we have the greater society, greater culture that shapes everything about our society. And so, oftentimes, when you look at smaller organizations or even uh, including schools and churches, those smaller organizations, those smaller systems, those smaller subcultures oftentimes reflect the, the overarching culture. And so I think it's important, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing depending upon the overarching culture. And so let me just go over briefly some of your response. I compiled some of these. Some of you had some similar things that I combined. One person talked about communication as a reflection of what a person has done and their personality. What's cool about that particular contribution is it takes in consideration that communication is very contextualized. Communication is often based upon our own frame of reference, and frame of reference simply entails what we've experienced, what we've done, and so there is not a one size fits all communication style. There isn't a one communication book that you could read that's going to give you all you need to know because communication is based upon the people, and people we're different. And even if there was a book written upon me and my communication styles and how I enjoy to communicate, the things I like, the things I dislike, the things I do well, the things I struggle, that book would have multiple editions each, not even each year, but maybe month to month and week to week and even day to day, depending upon what mood I'm in. And so we can't, even with dealing with one individual, we can't even say, here's what always works. Because people are always changing, thus our communication is always changing. Someone said it's important to have this knowledge in terms of those disciplines in those fields because without it, we cannot begin to interpret communication between individuals. All these factors shape who people are. So several of you said that going back to what we've already learned, we're all multicultural. We all have lots of cultural identities. Thus, it makes sense that when dealing with people who are so complex, so rich, so diverse, that we need to be able to pull from different areas, different disciplines. And that's one thing I really appreciate about communication in the field of communication is we pull a lot of our concepts, a lot of our theories, a lot of our terms from other disciplines. Where if you study psychology, psychology normally looks at the person from this psychological standpoint. If you study sociology, looks at it from the social interaction standpoint. Anthropology from a biological standpoint, and at a historical standpoint. Whereas communication takes a little bit of all those things. And so when you're talking about becoming a better communicator, especially in terms of intercultural communication, you're taking into consideration uh, the racial and ethnic background of a person. You're taking their gender, think those types of things in consideration. But you're also taking in consideration where they were raised. You're taking in consideration the things they've been exposed to, good and bad. You're taking in consideration context. So it's not just the content of that person, but the context. And sometimes we miss the mark when we don't give credence and enough value to the context. Now, we still need to let the individual have the opportunity to express themselves in a way that may contradict the context. And so we can't lump everyone into the same thing, even if they're in the same context. We still got to give each individual the opportunity to express themselves in their individual manners. Someone says it's important to have an understanding of history, economics, etc., because the way people have been personally affected will change how they communicate about those subjects. This is so important, and several of you touched on this concept. Think about certain subjects we could talk about, whatever the subject may be. And we often fall into the trap of thinking that the subject itself is just the end all be all. And regardless of who's talking about the subject, regardless who's dealing with the subject, we expect the same types of responses because of the subject. And so there were two theorists in the area of communication who talked about this. And one had this theory that said that the content, the artifact, the thing being read, the thing being watched, so this piece of information and the author of that information determines what the information means. So that's it's the theory of distanciation, and it's so that distanciation is because you're distancing yourself. So as the reader, as the hearer, as the interpreter, I must distance myself from the material in terms of I can't interpret the material based upon my frame of reference. I have to let the person who originated the material tell me what this thing means. So a person who's lived a certain thing, they get to determine how it impacts them. I don't get to determine that. I don't get to speak on someone else's behalf and tell their story. I don't get to say, well, here's how you should view this thing. No, they say based upon my experiences, here's how I view it. I have to distance myself from that and give them the ability to express themselves accordingly. Another theorist said, no, I kind of disagree with that, and he talked about how the reader or the observer, the person who is subject to this information, they get to determine what it means. And all of a sudden, my interpretation of this thing is what matters. And I think that's important when we're dealing with people. We often want to interpret other people's experiences. How could someone feel this way? Why don't they see it this way? Who could ever see this thing negatively? This is one of the greatest things ever. Well, it may be one of the greatest things ever for some of us, but for someone else, they may have a poor experience, a bad experience with that particular thing, and that has shaped their view of that thing. So it's important that we look at history. It's important that we look at anthropology, politics. Think about the role in just our country alone that politics has played in how certain groups have fared in America. Policies, rules, laws. In America, all those things weren't the same for everyone at all times in our country. Because of that, that has shaped individuals, that has shaped people groups. But then another group who maybe hasn't been influenced negatively by those same laws and things of nature may say, why would someone not respect laws? Why would someone not respect democracy or voting? Why, and so all those things are determined by historical accounts, historical actions and things that have actually taken place, and how individuals interpret that. And so I think a lot of you touched on that it's important that we don't just lump everyone in, but we see and give them the opportunity to express themselves according to their own experiences. Someone says anthropology allows us the very basis of understanding the fiber of each person. The ability to understand patterns and behaviors gives us the advantage to have clarity on social norms as well. Yet, so this whole idea, social norms, just the concept of norms speaks to what is normal and who gets to determine what's normal. And so even that concept itself can be problematic and troubling for some. Who who gets to decide the standard of what's normal? And so social norms in one culture may be different in another culture. You know, something as simple as timeliness. My wife and I, we've had the opportunity to live in uh, Jamaica where it was more laid back far as time. You get there when you get there, and it was supposed to conclude at a certain time, and we may stretch it out and go longer, and it's all good because we're interacting with people. Relationships are so important that as long as time is being spent with people, there's no real time limits. Whereas in certain cultures, time is very regulated. You start at a certain time, you end at a certain time, you cap the time. But those are social norms associated with particular cultures. And we need to be able to value and respect those different norms. But sometimes we believe that different is not just different, but different is wrong. But it's important that we recognize that having a better understanding of the individuals, having a better understanding of those cultures, historically speaking, economically speaking, all those things will help shape, okay, here's why they do this. Here's why this is so important to them. Here's why this is something that's not as important to them. And so, like my wife, her family is Caribbean. Her father's from Jamaica, her mother's from Trinidad, but she grew up in New York. So there may be certain holidays such as the 4th of July or Thanksgiving, which traditionally may not be as important to them. They may celebrate it as a day off and may cook some food, but it may not necessarily have the same meaning as someone who's born in America, things of that nature. And so all those social norms are oftentimes determined upon who the individuals are, what people groups they come from, the historical context. Context is very important. Someone says it's important to have a knowledge of history, economics, social science, etc., because it helps us understand those different layers. And because communication has its origin in other disciplines, and this is something I talked about earlier, that's what I love about communication. It is so multifaceted, it's interdisciplinary in so many ways. So when you try to get better at communicating, or when I address issues as a pastor, as a professor, as a husband, I'm always trying to be mindful that to what can I take from communication? What can I take from psychology? What can I take from sociology? What can I take from anthropology? What can I take from theology? All these things, because we're so complex. You can't just, someone goes through a certain situation and they're struggling and you just approach it from a strictly psychological standpoint. You're going to miss out so much. You approach it strictly from a, even from a theological standpoint. You know, there's certain types of issues when dealing with counseling that, yeah, I can go to the Bible and say here's what the Bible talks about, but I also need to have some understanding of psychology and things of that nature also, to see the emotional effects, you know, what's going on. And so I think it's just very important that we have that multifaceted interdisciplinary approach. It's going to definitely help us in terms of communicating, especially in across intercultural boundaries. And lastly, someone talked about to be able to understand one another, we must be able to focus on each other's beliefs, values, culture, and understand those. This is so important. I'm not sure if any of you ever experienced this, but maybe if you've had someone who says they truly appreciate you, they truly love you, yet they fail to recognize some of your unique cultural beliefs and values. They fail to recognize how history has influenced you, how politics have influenced you. And they focus solely on you as an individual. I care about you as an individual. And I'm going to try to ignore all these other things, although these other things shape who you are as an individual. Whether it's me saying I don't see color, if you're talking to someone, a person of color, whether it's me supporting policies and laws that may negatively impact you, but I say I love you and care for you, but I may support things that are damaging to you. I think it's important that if we're truly going to value each other and care for each other, and it doesn't mean we have to totally agree with everything, but we must be empathetic enough and willing enough to say, hey, if I say I truly care about you, that means I need to care about the things that you care about. I need to be concerned about the things that negatively impact you. But that means I got to know history. I got to know how these laws are affecting certain people. I got to know context. I got to hear the story behind the story instead of me just going by what I see on the surface. So I think that's a very important lesson for all of us to learn. I hope you've been blessed by this particular forum. Continue to get your papers in. They're due tonight by midnight. Some of you have already gotten them in. I'm trying to get those graded and back to you. Once again, I ask that you extend grace. We do have a large class, and I want to be able to edit those and get you some great feedback. But I will get them back to you as promptly as I can. I'll continue to work on this week's form for module number 3, and I hope you have a blessed day. Try to stay cool. Be safe.